Hi everyone, I think I'll get started now. So my name is Matt Wilmot. I am the Open Access Collection Strategist at the California Digital Library. And I have the privilege of following a lot of really good talks at this conference about moving towards open access, renegotiating contracts, rethinking how we're dealing with publishers, breaking up big deals. All of these seem to be really big themes at this conference. And a lot of these talks really underscore a need for a good grasp of the data, right? But what does that really mean, and how do we get there, right? And so that's really my main role at CDL, and so that's what I'm going to talk a bit about today. So I'm going to start by recapping a little bit of background on what the University of California is doing in this space. Our faculty library committee has started to send signals to us around efforts to transition our investments from subscriptions to open access publishing. This really started with this document, a declaration of rights and principles to transform scholarly communication that came from our faculty library committee. I want to say February of 2018, April of 2018 is right on there. And it ranges from statements that are fairly straightforward, like things like no copyright transfers, no waivers of our open access policy, to things that are actually pretty lofty and aspirational. No deals without open access offsets, no new paywalls for our work. Right, and this direction from our faculty is really telling us where they want us in the library to go when we're thinking about negotiating with journal publishers. Similarly, a couple months later, we got signals from our system-wide library advisory committee, which really represents a lot more in the way of administration of the university, sending similar signals. So this call to action really gave us a dual imperative to, when we're negotiating with journal publishers, work on controlling the cost that we're expending with these publishers, so keeping things at a cost that the library can sustain, and also working to transition spend from investing in subscriptions to investing in open access publishing. And then over the last 2 years or so, all 10 of the campuses of the UC system have signed on to the expression of interest for the OA 2020 initiative. And this really signals a commitment from the campuses, and I should stress that this comes from the faculty on the campuses and not the libraries choosing to invest in this, or choosing to sign this. And so this really sends another signal from the faculty that they want us in the library to work to convert our spend from supporting the subscription model to supporting sustainable open access models. And so we in the library really took these as signals to mean that we should be moving towards transformative agreements ourselves as we're interacting with publishers. We should be thinking about how we can transform our spend with those publishers from subscriptions to open access. Of course, there's a lot of areas where we need to develop new, deeper understanding to be able to do that effectively. We really need to understand the current environment that we operate in, how and where our authors are publishing, how much they're publishing, what they might be spending that we don't know about. We need to better understand the environment that we're transitioning to. So what does this look like that we're aiming for? Who are the stakeholders? What are the players? And how does the funding flows work? And then we need to understand how the models that we develop to make this transition happen would impact those various stakeholders. So what changes in the interactions between the authors and the library and the university as a whole and the publishers as we move through this transition. So I've really latched onto this concept of needing to move beyond traditional library return on investment. Because these transformative agreements that we're talking about with publishers, which are incorporating both payments for subscription and payments for open access, they really represent a new way of doing business with publishers, right? And so earlier in my career, I did a lot of more traditional collections analysis. And the relationship with publishers and vendors at the time was generally simpler, right? We in the library would pay for access to content or ownership of content or services, and our analysis was focused on the return on that investment. So how many uses did those things that we buy get, or how many uses did those services get? With transformative agreements, there's a lot more in the way of moving parts that we need to take into account. And that's why we really need to move beyond the traditional concept of ROI and into more of a predictive model, right? We need new types of data to make these analyses. So data on author publication patterns, different types of journal characteristics so that we can understand, this really gets to the previous slide, to understanding the environment that we work in now. Also, as we're building these models around what is going to be published in the future, particularly if we're building models that depend on publishing volume, we need to make some predictions based on past data, but we don't know the volume of publishing in advance. And so we need to understand what we think the volume of publishing could be, and we need to understand how to make predictions about that moving forward. We might also be talking about negotiating around expenditures that would be coming from outside of the library. So particularly in some of our models that we're negotiating with publishers, like our agreement with Cambridge University Press, some of the payments are coming from granting agencies through authors and not directly from the library. And so we need to understand how that would work. And that's another sort of moving part of how do authors engage with this and bring in their grant funding. Right? And that gets to the next bullet, which is the payment structures depend on actors that are outside of the library. So we don't have control over how authors will behave in response to some of the different incentives we're giving them. We can make some educated guesses about that, but that's another variable that we need to take into account when we're doing these analyses. And finally, we're working to exercise control over an area that was previously really completely unregulated. Right? This has kind of been a wild west in that authors are interacting directly with publishers, and the university has no idea what its total spend is with a given publisher. And so we really need to develop that understanding of what the overall interaction is with a publisher. So I think these really underscore the need to develop a better understanding of the world that we're moving into. Right? We need to fundamentally understand what this means for our own bottom lines in the libraries, in the universities, but also how those financial flows are shifting, maybe from libraries to research funders, or vice versa even. And we need to work towards models that will match our local priorities. So thinking about what our faculty are driving towards in those motivating statements that they're giving us, figuring out how to fit our models into those priorities that they give us. Speaking of our faculty, we also need to be able to garner support for what we're trying to do from our faculty and other stakeholders within our institution. And employing sort of advanced data analysis is a really effective way to do that. Our faculty are generally very data-driven in their own jobs, and they really respect when we come to them with well-developed, data-driven and evidence-driven proposals. And we need to be on equal footing with the vendors because we're talking about changing the way we're doing business with them. You can bet they're doing a lot of data analysis around what that looks like for them. And so to have conversations eye to eye, we need to do the same thing so that we can be speaking the same language and we can have a mutual understanding of what's going on between us and the vendors or the publishers. So with that groundwork laid, let's talk a little about how we at the California Digital Library have been building out our data capacity and some of the tools that we've been able to create and the insights that we can glean from them. So for us, it really started with building a base publication data set. This was how we got a sense of what our authors' publication patterns are so that we could measure those and make some projections based off of them. Our primary source for this data has been Web of Science. Their data is historically the most well-indexed, and particularly they have a couple fields that are well-indexed that we really rely on that we're not able to get from other sources. Specifically, corresponding author data, affiliation, and just the status of being a corresponding author on the article is important to our analyses. and also information about grant acknowledgement statements and thinking about where authors might have grant funding available and from what sources those would come from, as we're thinking about how we in the library might work to build structures where we could share the cost of publication with authors granting agencies. For our publication pattern analyses, we also add a few additional components from various sources that make these a little more impactful. The particular one that I've called out here is the OA status of an article or a journal. That really helps us understand some of the choices that our authors are already making around open access, and think about how we can move forward in this world, and also what sorts of responses authors might have to incentives that they're given. I bring in the article level OA status from Unpaywall, which is a really valuable data set that's indexing if and where articles are openly available. And also I can bring in data from DOAJ as well about at the journal level to make some projections about which articles in those journals are open access. We also bring in some other data that's not really mentioned here, but it's sort of ad hoc as we need to. So examples of that are things like subject data, which we bring in from Essential Science Indicators. That's another Clarivate product. We bring in impact metrics from Scopus sources when we need to. And we identify special cases as they come up. So things like Scope 3 journals, which really play a role in this open access realm, but are maybe not well addressed through some of the other analyses that we've done. We can bring in data about those journals separately. So it's worth spending a minute talking about Web of Science as a data source for this, because of course it's not a perfect data source. No data source is, right? In particular, Web of Science selects for impact and not necessarily for comprehensiveness. What that means is that they're bound to be missing some of our publication output, but it's a trade-off that we're willing to make in exchange for the deeper data indexing that I talked about a minute ago. So at CDL, I've worked to address this by creating a publisher-specific scaling factor. It's essentially an estimate of how much more publishing our authors are doing with a publisher in journals that are not covered by Web of Science. So I really accomplished this using data from Crossref, comparing that to Web of Science coverage statements. So looking at how many articles are in journals that are covered by Web of Science compared to how many articles are published by that publisher in Crossref. Of course, that's not a perfect comparison because our authors tend to be more likely to publish in the journals that are covered by Web of Science, so we have to scale that back a little bit. So I was able to do some sort of cross-checking of these using some previously observed publishing patterns from other analyses that we've done or that we've found. So we did some of this in the Pay It Forward project, and also the STM report has some good data about this. And also cross-checking with publisher data that we find to be reliable so that we can compare the estimates that we get against what publishers are telling us that our authors are publishing. So just some examples that I think make this a little clearer what I'm talking about when I say a scaling factor, right, is at two different ends of the spectrum. So one end is a publisher like the National Academy of Sciences. They publish one journal and it's covered by Web of Science. And so we don't expect that there is any publication with the National Academy of Sciences that is not covered by Web of Science. So their scaling factor is 1. I would take our total publication volume with them, multiply it by 1, and that would be what we estimate we publish with them. At the other end of the spectrum is a publisher like De Gruyter, right? They publish a lot of journals. A lot of them are small and niche titles that are maybe out of scope for Web of Science. And so their scaling factor is quite a bit higher. So what I've calculated is that it's about 2.4. What that means is when we find 10 articles published by UC authors in Web of Science, we multiply that by 2.4 to estimate that there are actually 24 articles published in De Gruyter journals by UC authors, the 10 that we found in Web of Science, and then 14 more in non-covered journals that we don't know about, right? So we don't have article level data for those 14 more articles, but we do at least have an estimate of the overall publication volume and what publishers those are coming from. So that can help us estimate, based on the data we get from Web of Science, what our actual overall publication volume is. So let's look at some of the results from the institutional publishing analysis sheet that I developed that really helps us sort of visualize and interpret some of this data. So what I have up here is our basic sort of publisher distribution chart, right? Showing the top 25, I think, publishers by volume for the University of California. And I know the names are pretty small on here, but I think you can kind of get the picture, and you can probably guess at which publishers are which, certainly at the top. And it's probably no surprise that the top 5 publishers publish about half of our content. The top 25 publishers publish about 80% of our content, right? So this is the same sort of pattern that we see when we see other institutions do similar analyses. One of the powerful things about this, though, is the panels that are on the side here that really make it a dynamic analysis. So we can distribute this to others across the UC system and let them sort of use this to run their own analyses. They can choose a specific campus or deselect certain campuses that they're not interested in. They can choose to look at just corresponding authored articles or look at all articles with UC authors. They can choose what document types they want to include. They can choose whether they want to use that Web of Science scaling factor that I talked about or not, and they can narrow it down to different subjects. And so this really becomes a dynamic analysis of our overall publication patterns that we can learn a lot from and develop a lot of strategy with. In addition, because we have the unpaywall data mapped into this data set, we can see how much of our content is published open access already and make some inferences about what our authors are doing currently. So this is looking at our total publication from the University of California in 2017, and we can see that almost 50% of that is already openly available in some form, either direct from the publisher or in some sort of repository. We can also narrow this chart down by subject as well, and that really helps us to plan some strategy around where negotiations might be more impactful, where some targeted outreach might be more impactful, right? We can really sort of learn about what authors in different fields are doing around open access. So we can compare charts like this one, which is for articles in molecular biology and genetics, where there's a pretty strong culture of open access publishing, with charts like this one, which is all of our articles in arts and humanities, where there's less opportunity and less of a culture to publish open access. And we can draw some conclusions about that. And then, of course, we can narrow this down to specific publishers, right? What I've put up here is the American Physical Society, which physics has, in general, a culture of green open access sharing, right? And so this is probably not a surprise once you think about, what we're looking at. This actually brings up one little quirk of the unpaywall data that we're using, is they go in sort of a priority order. What I'm mapping here is what they call the best open access location. And so I don't know if you can actually read these, but you can see sort of at the top that the green archive sharing is actually a fairly small slice. That's because the publisher-hosted green open access sort of takes priority. That publisher-hosted is really through the Chorus initiative. So APS has author manuscripts online through the Chorus initiative that kind of, in unpaywall's hierarchy, trumps the fact that articles are maybe in archives. And so this doesn't necessarily mean that only 7% of APS is an archive. I would expect that to be a bit higher. But it does mean that over 95, looks like about 98% of articles in APS are available in some way through their various policies, right? And so we can use these to develop strategies around specific publisher policies that we might want to take advantage of or that we might want to change. So we can, once we have this publication data set, we can really build on it to conduct some more advanced analyses that help us to set some more strategy or really understand the environment that we're working in. And one big example is estimating how much our authors are spending on APCs now outside of our subscription spend. This really goes to understanding what the overall environment that we're operating in now is. So we start with the publishing data set that we've developed, which we saw this built in the last screen. And then we add in list price APCs. And this has traditionally been sort of a difficult data set to get a handle on. Over the last few months, I've been using a tool called the DeltaThink Open Access Data and Analytics tool. It was originally built as sort of a publishing market research tool. But they're also selling subscriptions to libraries and finding that it's really valuable in helping libraries conduct some of these global analyses that they might not otherwise be able to do. So it has list price APCs across publishers and across business models in a way that DOAJ does not have and individual publishers do not have, right? It's worth tossing in another note here about data sourcing, though, because this is another point where the idea has come up that we need to think critically about the data that we're using. And I think that's maybe a small lesson to take from this talk, is that as you're working through these data analyses, it's really important to think about the sources you're using and the various strengths and weaknesses they might have and strategies for overcoming that. So the previous example we saw was Web of Science, where it had some really good strengths and then it had some weaknesses that we developed a scaling factor to overcome. The example here would be that Delta Think is very comprehensive in terms of working across publishers, working across business models in a way that no other data set is. But they're only updated periodically, and they maybe don't have quite as in-depth of a listing as a list directly from the publisher site might have, right? And so if we want to have a perfect list, we're probably going and getting individual publisher sites, getting their lists of APCs, and mapping all those in separately. But of course, that's less scalable than just linking to a single source like Delta Think, right? So it really brings out, you have to think critically about the analysis you're doing, and what your priorities are and what your capacity for that sort of scalability is. So one of the things we've been able to learn from this type of analysis is the overall scope of how much our authors are spending on APCs outside of our subscription content. And we can also sort of look at how this differs across the different publishers that we work with, right? And so what I've pulled out here are a few little case studies of what we've learned from this analysis, some of which were actually quite surprising to us. So Elsevier, we kind of know pretty well. They're a large, multidisciplinary, traditionally subscription publisher. In comparison to the size of their journal corpus, they have relatively few large open access journals, and their hybrid publication is fairly limited as well. And so doing this analysis, we saw that our authors are only spending about 11% more on top of our subscription than our subscription cost is. Of course, that's not nothing. We spend a lot with Elsevier, and so that's still a pretty large total. But compared to what we spend in subscriptions, it's maybe less significant than other publishers that we identified. For example, Springer Nature, which is also a large multidisciplinary, traditionally subscription publisher, but they've really moved strongly into the open access world with their acquisition of Biomed Central, their mega journals, which are Nature Communications and Scientific Reports that our authors publish a lot in. And so we found that on top of our subscription spend with Springer, our authors are also spending another 77% in APCs, which really changed our view of the picture of our total institutional investment in that publisher. And it changes sort of the conversation we might have with Springer around how we move towards a transitional model or a transformative model. Similarly, AAAS is sort of a different type of publisher. They're a small, mission-driven publisher. They published only one journal for a while. They've started to add more. A couple of years ago, they added one new journal, Science Advances, that has become a really large open access journal. And our authors have really apparently enjoyed publishing in that journal because that one journal basically doubles our institutional investment with AAAS, right? And so this is really important information to know when we go to talk with the publishers so that we can communicate to them about our total institutional investment and not just the library's investment, because that's the scale we're trying to think on here. And so across the UC system, we were pretty shocked to learn that on top of the $40 million or so that we spend in subscriptions to content, our authors are also spending another $10 million on APCs in for hybrid open access or in full open access journals. That's a huge amount of money that is really outside of any sort of regulation or negotiation that really drives home how important it is to work on this. So the next step here is to actually model some potential transformative agreements. And this gets directly to where we're going and what it looks like for stakeholders. So of course, modeling these agreements is pretty complex, but we can see the different components that go into the equation here. And of course, I use equation sort of figuratively, not literally. But we start with our publication data set again, and we map in more financial data. So we talked about the list price APCs that we brought in previously. We also want to bring in subscription data so that we really have a picture of our whole investment with the publisher. But of course, that's not enough, right? We can't just take all that data, put it into a bowl and mix it, and then have it spit out exactly the agreement we want. And this is where a lot of that uncertainty that I talked about earlier comes in. Right, we have a lot of local priorities that we need to take into account that create variability. The publisher or the journal has a lot of priorities around their business model or their price setting behavior that's really important. And we need to make projections about how our authors will behave. And we don't know exactly how they'll respond to the different types of incentives that we might give them. So with that, I'm just going to walk through quickly the tool that I built to sort of pull all of this data together. If we were to look at the back end of this data set, it would really be a lot of the raw data that I talked about earlier, right? All of the raw publishing data, all of the APC list price data and business model data that we had. And I should mention that I've built this as an example, but this is not using real data. This is using sample data. So don't go thinking that this is exactly what we publish and spend with Springer. But I've built this as an example with Springer, which has several different imprints. So it's a really good sort of illustration of what this tool can do. So the first section is this orange section. And this is all in an Excel spreadsheet. So we kind of build through the sheet as we go. Right, the first section is really about scoping and scaling. So how are we scaling the inputs? What year are we projecting for? How much publication growth are we projecting? Do we want to use those scaling factors that I built? And what imprints do we want to include in this model? The next section is really about what we're currently investing with the publisher. And so this has two pieces, right? It has one piece that is asking the user to input what the subscription spend is with that publisher so that we have that information in the tool. The second piece is really calculating that APC spend that is outside of the current subscription model. And so at the bottom, it sort of pulls all of that together to give sort of a holistic picture of what the institution's spend is with the publisher. And based on some of the data we have about grant funding acknowledgement statements, we make some projections about how much of that APC spend is funded by grants versus funded by other sources at the institution. So we can see what the different stakeholders have in the game now and compare that to what we might model moving forward. So the next section is where we start to really get deep into modeling and where the arrows for sections get pretty messy and pointing all over the place, right? So I won't ask you to look through this whole bowl of spaghetti, but I'll just talk through sort of the top section here is where we're projecting what APC we might be able to negotiate with the publisher if we're talking about a pay per article model, right? So we're trying to talk with publishers about getting a lower APC than list price. What we can do here is project what that APC is, and then we can, based on our existing publishing data, we can estimate what our average APC would be across that publisher, given that publishing discount. So we can understand what these different discounts might mean for our authors. In the bottom section, we can take in some parameters about how the library might be splitting funding with the granting agencies. That's, like I was saying, a part of the model that we're working towards. And based on that, the sheet makes some calculations around what we would be spending in this transformative agreement based on all of the parameters that we put in earlier from which different sources for which types of journals. And it compares that against what we're spending now, which we calculated in the previous section, from different sources and on different types of journals, right? So it really gives us sort of a side-by-side view of projected spend in this new model versus current spend. And that lets us get an idea of how the spend might transition from different stakeholders, from different types of journals to other types of journals or to other stakeholders. This is really what we want to get at when we're thinking about what does the model mean for us and how we can sort of move forward with it, right? And then finally, there's one last section that really helps us actually put some numbers to this to build proposals that we can make to publishers. So thinking about what sort of cost control mechanisms we might want to put in place, what base costs we want. It has some parameters around stress testing, so we can see, maybe we're projected to publish about 100 articles, but what happens if we publish 150, or what happens if we publish 75? We need something to sort of calculate what that looks under these different constraints. And so this really lets us do that sort of stress testing and spits out the numbers that we might want to put in an actual proposal. And I should say that's another benefit of being really thorough about these types of data analysis, right, is that we're actually making proposals to publishers, not requesting proposals from publishers. And so it really changes the way we're interacting with them because we have a really good handle of our publishing environment and what we're trying to get at. So of course, there's a lot more we can do with these data sets and that we have been doing, and I'm not going to run through each of these, but we can build things like risk tables, so based on different variables, where might there be risk for the library versus where might there be savings for the library. We can build tables that have, or worksheets that look at multiple publishers at once, so we can see how funding might shift between publishers in sort of a holistic model. We can even do that across our entire publishing landscape. That's how I got that 40 million, 10 million split earlier. And we can push this data into other tools like Tableau that make even more accessible dashboards and interactive tools to help others understand the insights that we're able to glean from this. So I've thrown a lot of numbers and pictures and data at you. If there are only a couple takeaways you get from this, I would like the biggest one to be that this data analysis work is critically necessary as we're moving into these new areas and thinking about how to move forward with publishers in this sort of new world. Right, we really need to understand the environment that we're working in. We really need to have confidence in the approach that we're taking. And we really need to convey compelling messages because that messaging piece is really critical to the success of these models, making sure that our researchers and our faculty understand what we're doing. So if you're moving into working on transformative agreements, I would urge you to not skip this step of really doing your homework on figuring out what you need to do. Of course, it's not trivial, right? This was not easy to put all these together and it took a lot of work. The other challenge is there are always unique aspects to consider as we're replicating these, right? From publisher to publisher, there are different uniquenesses that we need to take into account. If we're looking across disciplines, there might be differences that we need to take into account that are either disciplinary culture or publisher culture. Reapplying this to a different geographic region, there will probably be changes to be made. So it's really important to be flexible and responsive, and I've tried to build these tools to do that with all these different variables that we can put in. But I still find that every time I have a new analysis to do, I have to sometimes go into the back end and like tweak one little thing because there's something I didn't expect, right? So expect to need to be flexible in these things. Because of this, I would maybe recommend trying to expand some capacity if you're actually thinking about these transformative agreements to have somebody who has some expertise in data analysis or in data gathering to sort of work towards this. Either develop that in people that are either on staff or seek out hiring somebody to do that. But the nice thing about being part of a community like the library community where there's a lot of collaboration and we have meetings like the Charleston Conference where we can come together and talk about these things is that this is not something you need to necessarily do by yourself. You don't need to just take these slides and then go home and say, okay, I guess I'll try to figure this out myself, right? The sheets that I built here are all in Excel and they're shareable and can be applied to other data sets. So if you can do the work of pulling the data and putting them into those sheets, you can use the tools that I built to replicate these analyses locally. We at the UC have built a negotiating toolkit that really came from sort of lessons that we learned as we were going through this process. That has a chapter on data analysis that can help talk you through some of these strategies as well. And while we don't necessarily have the bandwidth to just take on your data analysis projects, right, we have invested a lot of thought in this, and we don't want that to go to waste. And so we're here to help with informal consultation, bandwidth permitting. But if you're working through these sheets and you don't understand something, you can shoot me an email, and I'm happy to try to help you work this out. So with that, I'll leave you with some resources. This is a link to the toolkit that I mentioned. The bit.ly link goes to a box folder that has the spreadsheets that were in the screenshots here, and my contact information is up there. So I'm happy to take questions. We have about 5 minutes left in our time. Thank you. And I'm supposed to remind you, if you do have questions, we need to use the microphone because we're videotaping this.
Maybe just a quick question. How do you calculate that scaling factor? Or how do we approach that?
Yeah, so that took a fair bit of work to sort of pull that together. And the scaling factors that I calculated are in one of the spreadsheets that's up there. So you can kind of take what I've done, although it's somewhat UC specific. But it was really based on the concept that while Web of Science doesn't cover everything, in general, Crossref assigns and tracks the DOIs for all of the articles that these publishers, at least if they're working with Crossref, they're contributing all of their article information there so that their DOI is resolved properly, right? And so we can pull data from Crossref about how many articles a publisher puts out, and then we can compare that to data that we pull from Crossref about how many articles are in Web of Science covered journals that publisher puts out. And so we get a sort of a general percentage of how much of a publisher's content is covered in Web of Science based on that. And so we can build the scaling factor based on that analysis.
Hi, thank you. I'm Kate McCready from the University of Minnesota. I wondered, did you do any looking, just because I'm very curious about it, of how much of the APCs that you calculated that are being paid out of pocket versus by grant funding or your institution? Did you do any looking into that?
So it's hard to find the data that really tracks that really well because that would really be in sort of our financial tracking systems. But it's not well coded there when authors are paying APCs and then requesting reimbursement. Plus, if they're paying out of pocket, they might not even end up requesting reimbursement. So there's not a great internal data source for that. What we used for that is the assumption that if authors have grant funds available, that's probably what they're going to use to pay these APCs in almost every case. There are libraries on our campuses that have an APC fund, and so we could sort of map in on those campuses based on the parameters of the APC fund. Maybe authors are getting some funding from there, but generally those funds also have the policy that if an author has grant funding, they ask the author to use grant funding before using that APC fund. And so that's why we brought in the grant acknowledgement statements from Web of Science, is to sort of operate under the assumption that if an author acknowledges a grant on their article, that's probably what they use to pay an APC if they needed to. And that's kind of the split that we made. And so in certain subjects where there's heavy grant funding, we would assume that almost all authors are paying those out of grant funds. So like when we do an analysis of PLOS, for example, we expect that 90-somewhat% of that revenue to PLOS is coming from grant funds through our authors. But in other fields where there's less grant funding, they might be finding other sources at the institution or their own pocket that they would be using. And so we kind of build that into the analysis when we're doing that comparison about how much do grants pay versus how much does the institution pay. All right, well, if there are no other questions, I really appreciate you coming, and thanks for your time. And I'm happy to chat afterwards, too. I have a little time here, so thanks very much.